wind cuts like knives, dry, invisible, and merciless. Snowflakes drift sideways, not down, riding gusts that twist through the fur-wrapped shoulders of a lone figure moving slowly across a pale white expanse. His breath freezes instantly on his beard, turning it into a stiff web of ice. All around him, the world is silent, but not still. The trees moan in the cold. Somewhere in the distance, something howls. This is survival during the Ice Age. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the slow, grinding battle where every hour is a test of endurance and ingenuity. The landscape is magnificent and terrible. A continent buried beneath glaciers as tall as mountains and forests made brittle by frost. It is both beautiful and borderline suicidal to live here. So before you enjoy the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. The man trudging through the snow isn't alone. Behind him, tucked between icy ridges, lies a camp. Smoke rises in thin ribbons from a fire carefully shielded by stacked stones and reindeer hides. Around it huddle several figures. Men, women, children. All wrapped in layers of furs and leather. Their breath clouds the air like ghostly signals, and their eyes constantly scan the distance. In this world, danger is never more than a heartbeat away. Only the most adaptable humans survived here. This wasn't a brief cold snap. It was a global tantrum that lasted thousands of years. The last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, dropped sea levels by over 120 meters and turned huge swaths of land into frozen deserts. Whole species vanished. Forests became tundra. But somehow humans hung on. And how did they do it? By refusing to stay still. Mobility was key. The people of this era didn't build cities or even permanent villages. They moved with the seasons, following reindeer herds, mammoth migrations, and the shifting lines of cold and warmth like nomads of ice and instinct. They carried what they could, dragged what they needed, and left behind little more than footprints and the occasional mammoth-sized hole in the population. One of their secret weapons? Social bonds. It wasn't enough to be physically strong. You had to cooperate. That meant shared fires, shared food, shared parenting, and shared strategies for not freezing your toes off. Though, in fairness, frozen toes were basically a rite of passage. Their camps were like organic machines, efficient and minimal. A circle of hide tents, perhaps a central hearth and tools everywhere. Antler picks, stone scrapers, bone needles. Every item had a story. Every hand had a job. Every mistake could be fatal. And then there was the cold. Not the "I forgot my jacket" cold. This was cold that could shatter bone. Cold that could kill a baby in minutes. Cold that made rivers freeze in mid-flow and made you second-guess whether blinking was worth it. It was said among elders that the ice didn't just test you. It watched you. To combat it, people got creative. They layered furs and hides. They used powdered ochre to treat leather and prevent it from stiffening. They packed snow into walls and burned animal fat for light and warmth. And when the firewood ran out, they burned bones. No, really, mammoth bones burned surprisingly well. It was the prehistoric version of heating with weird stuff you find in the garage. And yes, they even had shoes. Very early shoes. Not exactly Air Jordans, more like Air Mammoths, made from hide, grass, and sinew, stuffed with moss for insulation. Fashionable? No. Functional? Enough to keep your feet attached to your legs, which was really all anyone wanted back then. There's a strange, lesser-known fact here. Some of the oldest known needles in history, 30,000 years old, come from Ice Age camps. Bone needles with eyelets, likely used to sew those hide garments with precision. It's easy to picture a mother stitching while a child plays nearby, and wolves howl just out of sight. But even with all that adaptation, they didn't always win. Entire groups vanished in snowstorms. Avalanches buried camps. Rivers cracked beneath travelers. Even mammoths could trample an unlucky hunter who got a bit too bold with his pointy stick. The Ice Age didn't do second chances, and yet, the humans endured. Every fire they lit was an act of rebellion. Every child born was a bet against extinction. Every laugh around the fire, every joke about how the fish tasted like frozen mud, was a defiant reminder. We are still here, so when you imagine this time, don't just think of caves and clubs. Think of ingenuity under pressure. Think of the will to learn from failure. Think of a community wrapped in fur, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the dark, whispering stories while the wind screamed outside. Because those stories? That's how they passed on survival. And just maybe, they laughed a little too. The first fire didn't start with a spark. It started with desperation. Somewhere deep in a frost-covered valley, a group of early humans huddled against a rock face, shaking in silence. One among them, curious or just plain cold enough to try anything, struck two stones together. Nothing happened at first, just a dull clack. But then, a flicker, a whisper of smoke, a fragile glow like the eye of some small, sleeping god. Fire. They weren't the first to find it. Lightning had scorched forests before, and volcanic embers had occasionally offered nature's matches. But this was controlled fire. This was the kind they could carry, protect, feed, and pass down like a sacred secret. It didn't just keep them warm, it made them human, changed everything. Once they had fire, early humans were no longer just animals with clever hands. They were alchemists of survival. They could cook, which made meat safer and easier to digest, important when your main meal source is something that might stomp you into the snow. They could keep predators away, dry wet clothes, and most importantly, warm their frozen feet. Now let's talk about those feet. If you've ever walked barefoot to grab the mail in winter, you've only tasted a sprinkle of what Ice Age humans endured daily. Frostbite was the world's most aggressive shoe salesman. That's why footwear became a matter of life and toes. Shoes in the Ice Age were handcrafted masterpieces. They layered soft inner leathers with rougher outer hides, often waterproofed with animal fat. Inside, moss and dry grass acted like prehistoric socks. And yes, they smelled exactly as you're imagining. But they worked. In fact, Otzi the Iceman, found frozen in the Alps after 5,000 years, wore remarkably advanced shoes made of bearskin, deerskin, and woven bark. If that's not the height of caveman couture, what is? Beyond shoes, they needed warmth all over. So, they became tailors long before they became farmers. With bone needles and sinew thread, they stitched clothing from reindeer, fox, and wolf hides. A skilled seamstress could make a full set of layered clothing that kept a person warm even in sub-zero blizzards. Here's a weird detail you probably didn't expect. Some Ice Age humans may have used powdered insect shells as insulation, crushed beetles, mixed with grease and stuffed into the seams of cloaks. Why? It repelled moisture, added thickness, and probably made them smell like a bug's bad day. Still worth it to stay alive. But even with fire and furs, they weren't out of danger. Fires went out, clothes tore, wet boots froze. So they developed routines, passed down like bedtime prayers. Never sleep with wet feet, keep your firewood dry, always rotate your furs by the fire. Early humans may not have had TikTok life hacks, but they had survival wisdom carved into their bones. Of course, none of this meant comfort. Nights were still miserable. Joints ached, fingers cracked and bled. But imagine the joy, no, the triumph, of waking up alive after a snowstorm, seeing your breath in the morning light, and feeling your toes wiggle. Small victories meant everything. That's why the fire itself became sacred. Camps were built around it. Stories were told by it. The youngest were taught to feed it. The elders warned not to waste its fuel. Embers were transported in moss-lined pouches between camps, primitive but effective fireproof containers. Losing a fire on a journey could be a death sentence, so someone was always on ember duty. Let's be honest, probably a guy named Grug who took his job way too seriously. Fire also allowed them to settle briefly in places they never could have survived before. Caves, rocky outcrops, or even open tundra became viable shelters once you could trap heat inside. Walls of ice and snow were sometimes packed around a tent to reduce wind chill. Think of it as the first central heating system, just less reliable and more mammoth-scented. And while we're at it, yes, they did use mammoth dung as fuel. Dried properly, it burned surprisingly well. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but if you're faced with hypothermia and the only available log is from the business end of a mammoth, you learn not to be picky. That's Ice Age living, baby. Their fire tools improved over time, too. From simple flint and pyrite, they developed complex fire-starting kits with bark shavings, dried fungus, and spark stones. These kits were often carried like a medieval EDC, everyday carry. Because starting from scratch every time wasn't just annoying, it was deadly. All this ingenuity paints a clear picture. Early humans didn't survive the Ice Age because they were tough. They survived because they were clever. They looked at a frozen world, where even the sun seemed to shiver, and decided to outthink the cold. One fire, one fur coat, one pair of slightly crunchy shoes at a time. And they weren't just surviving. Around those fires, they sang. They danced. They painted the walls of caves with hunts and handprints and dreams. They whispered to the children about the spirits in the wind and the monsters in the dark. They remembered. They hoped. They laughed. Probably about who had to gather mammoth poop for the next fire. Because when the cold surrounded them like an ocean, fire was more than warmth. It was identity. It was memory. It was defiance. There were predators, and then there were Ice Age predators. Forget cute saber-toothed plushies or cartoon mammoths with hang-ups. These animals didn't star in movies. They starred in nightmares. For early humans, stepping outside the safety of camp wasn't just a brave act. It was a roll of the dice. And the dice had claws. Let's start with one of the big names. The cave lion. Despite the cuddly name, cave lions were enormous. Bigger than today's African lions, some the size of small horses, they prowled the perimeters of early human camps like ghostly assassins. These lions didn't just hunt deer or bison. Evidence shows they sometimes targeted humans. Or rather, tents full of humans. Imagine a creature as heavy as a dirt bike, slinking through the snow, blending with the rock, and waiting not for a weak target, but for the right moment. Then there were dire wolves. Yes, they were real, and no, they didn't come with HBO soundtracks. They were heavier, stockier, and more bone-crunchy than modern wolves. Unlike the sleek pack animals we know today, dire wolves were built like linebackers. They could chase prey for miles across frozen plains, and their jaw pressure could turn a reindeer femur into dust faster than you could say, "That was Uncle Thag's leg." And let's not forget the saber-toothed cat, most famously Smilodon. Despite being named like someone's dental floss, this cat was no joke. With fangs up to 7 inches long and a build like a pitbull meets puma, it didn't bother with stealth when brute force would do. Fossil evidence suggests it ambushed prey, pinning them with muscular forelimbs before delivering a devastating bite to the neck, or the face, or, well, really wherever it wanted. And humans? They were just another potential snack. So how did early humans survive this literal rogues gallery of nightmare fuel? First off, numbers. Safety wasn't just in pairs, it was in groups. Solo wanderers didn't last long in the Ice Age. In fact, there's a joke some Ice Age elders might have told. What has 2 legs, no weapons, and smells like dinner? The guy who left camp alone. Cue laughter and knowing glances at the guy who almost got eaten last week. Second, observation. Humans learned predator patterns. They studied tracks in snow, listened for bird calls that signaled danger, and watched for scavenger behavior. If vultures were circling a nearby hill, chances were something had died, and something else had done the killing. They also learned from failures. For instance, one early group might have tried sleeping near a den, warm, sheltered, great view of the stars. Then came the moment when a very annoyed cave bear returned home to find squatters in her living room. The survivors? They told the tale loud and often. Suddenly, caves with scratch marks outside became less popular. Lesson learned. Never rent a cave without checking for claw deposits. This brings us to one of the Ice Age's lesser-known but equally terrifying beasts, short-faced bears. These weren't your average salmon-slapping forest dwellers. They stood up to 12 feet tall on their hind legs and could run faster than a sprinter. One swipe could tear through bone. Basically, if you saw one, your only defense was prayer, and possibly throwing Thag in the opposite direction. But humans were never just prey. They adapted. At night, they placed thorny branches or mammoth bones around camp perimeters. They kept fires burning in shifts. Some groups even began using sound to protect themselves. Banging sticks, clapping stones, whistling in ways that mimicked predator calls. It wasn't foolproof, but it helped, and they got bolder. In regions like what's now France and Spain, cave art shows humans confronting animals that dwarfed them in size. These weren't just hunting murals, they were declarations. We see you. We know you. We might fear you, but we will not vanish quietly. Here's a strange but true fact. Fossilized bones show that some humans suffered injuries consistent with predator attacks, and survived. One skeleton bears deep tooth gouges on the arm, possibly from a lion or hyena, that had clearly healed over time. Which means, someone got chomped, he didn't die, and C had friends who stuck around to help him recover. You don't survive an Ice Age alone. You survive it with tribe, fire, and a good story about how you punched a wolf. Exaggeration was probably invented 5 minutes after the first near-death experience. And let's be real, sometimes humans got lucky. A sudden storm could drive off predators. A mammoth herd might trample through just in time to save a group from a stalking pack. Or the predator simply picked an easier meal. After all, humans were clever, but not always the top of the food chain. There's also the psychological edge. Humans, uniquely, could imagine future danger. They could plan for it, anticipate it. They saw claw marks and guessed what might have made them. They heard a howl and prepared. No other species did that on the same level. And that anticipation meant traps, ambushes, and eventually revenge. Predators were terrifying, yes, but over time they became teachers. By studying them, humans learned how to move, how to hide, how to hunt, and how to become the threat. And that changed everything. Because once the hunter understands the hunted, once the prey learns to think like a predator, the balance of power starts to shift. And somewhere out there, a cave lion watched a group of humans walk confidently across a snowy plain, spears in hand, firelight in their eyes, and for the first time, hesitated. The landscape was white, the rivers frozen, and the wind screamed like a banshee stuck in a snowdrift. Hunting was dangerous, gathering was risky, and going grocery shopping wasn't really a thing unless your idea of groceries included dried lizard and mammoth marrow. Yet, somehow, prehistoric humans didn't just not starve, they developed one of the most inventive menus in human history. Surviving an Ice Age wasn't just about killing big animals. It was about making the most of everything. They turned bones into soup, tendons into snacks, and eyeballs into, well, let's just say nobody let food go to waste. But let's rewind a little. A typical food source in the Ice Age wasn't a daily mammoth buffet. In fact, most meals were modest. Root vegetables dug from permafrost, berries flash frozen on bushes, or dried fish pulled from ice-covered streams and preserved in ways that would make a modern chef cry. They dried meat by fires, smoked it, or buried it in snow pits, turning the cold itself into nature's refrigerator. If they'd had hashtags, it would have been hashtag paleo meal prep. But what did they do when nothing moved? Winter in some regions could last months. Herds migrated. Small game hid. Fishing holes froze over. That's when humans got clever, trap clever. They created elaborate pitfalls using sharpened stakes covered with snow, or disguised pits with branches and bait. Small animals like hares, foxes, and even birds could be caught using tension traps made from twine and springy saplings. The traps were set and checked daily, kind of like the world's most brutal advent calendar. One clever method involved using natural ice corridors to channel animals. Imagine a narrow, icy ravine. One end was blocked. The other led straight into an ambush site. Hunters would drive animals into these frozen funnels where they had nowhere to run. It wasn't always successful, but when it worked, it worked. Some sites show entire groups of reindeer slaughtered in a single orchestrated stampede. Of course, not everything on the menu walked on four legs. When meat was scarce, humans turned to insects, frozen, crunchy protein bars. Beetles, larvae, and even grubs were gathered, roasted, and consumed with the sort of grim enthusiasm only someone who's been snowbound for a week can understand. There's even evidence of early humans collecting bird eggs and eating them raw, frozen, or lightly warmed over coals. Bird sushi, Ice Age edition. And plants? Yes, they found those too, even under the snow. Early humans identified frost-resistant roots, stored them in pits lined with grass, and fermented some for extra calories. Fermentation may have even been one of the first science experiments. Let's leave the stinky tuber in the ground and see what happens. One lesser-known food source? Bone grease. Sounds horrifying, but it's rich in calories. They'd smash large bones to extract marrow, then boil smaller fragments for hours until the fat rose to the top. Primitive broth rich with nutrients. Think of it like butter made from skeletons. Tasty and terrifying. Still, food wasn't always about necessity. Sometimes it was ceremonial. When a hunt succeeded, especially a large one, the tribe didn't just eat. They celebrated. Stories were told, dances performed, and special parts of the animal were reserved for elders or spiritual leaders. The liver of a mammoth might go to the oldest woman. The tongue? Maybe to the hunter who struck the final blow. It wasn't just nourishment. It was honor, memory, and gratitude wrapped into a single, steaming mouthful. There's an odd little Ice Age secret here, too. Frozen food preservation may have been discovered accidentally. Imagine someone leaving leftovers buried under snow to keep scavengers away, then forgetting about it for 2 weeks. When they finally dig it up, surprise, still edible-ish. The idea of cold storage became so effective that some groups intentionally buried food in snowbanks, marking the spot with sticks or stones. This practice became so advanced that archaeologists have uncovered what appear to be food caches, basically prehistoric pantries, carefully chosen spots near camp, always shaded, often near a slope to allow for snow cover. The people who created these weren't just reacting to nature. They were organizing against it, but sometimes there simply wasn't any food. That's when the hard decisions began. Early humans sometimes chewed on bark, boiled leather, or made hunger cakes from lichen and moss. Not exactly five-star cuisine, but it kept the body moving. Whether the body wanted to move is another story, and they didn't just think short-term. During warmer months, they stockpiled dried meats, hardened berries, smoked fish, all wrapped tightly and stored high in trees or deep in crevices to protect from animals. You could say they invented the first meal kits, minus the cheerful unboxing videos. But perhaps the most human part of their relationship with food was this: they shared it. It didn't matter if you caught the hair or boiled the roots. If someone was hungry, the meal was split. Even injured members, those unable to hunt, were fed. There's fossil evidence of disabled individuals who lived years past their injuries, clearly supported by their community. Compassion, it turns out, was just as important as calories. So while the Ice Age was brutal, cold, and packed with teeth on legs, early humans didn't just scrounge. They cooked, they stored, they feasted, and sometimes they even experimented. One poor soul probably tried to ferment snowberries in their armpit. We salute you, because food was never just food. It was survival. It was strategy. It was love, knowledge, memory, and maybe, just maybe, a snow-covered recipe passed from a grandmother to a grandson around a fire built from frozen dung. Bon appetit, Pleistocene style. A storm rolls across the steppe like a living wall, white, roaring, and merciless. The sky darkens as snow thickens, erasing distance, blurring the horizon into nothing but swirling frost. But tucked low behind a ridge, half buried in a windbreak of piled snow and mammoth ribs, a human shelter glows with firelight. Inside, a woman hums softly while mending a fur cloak. A child naps warm between layers of reindeer hide. And the wind, though still howling, stays outside. This is not a fluke. This is architecture Ice Age edition. When most people think of prehistoric humans, they picture dirty, rag-clad wanderers sleeping under trees. But the truth is far cooler, literally. Ice Age humans were engineers, craftsmen, and homebuilders. Their shelters weren't just improvised lean-tos. They were purpose-built, handcrafted habitats shaped by environment, necessity, and the occasional woolly mammoth skeleton. Let's talk mammoths for a moment. When one of these towering behemoths fell, whether by natural causes, predator attack, or a coordinated human ambush, it left behind more than just dinner. It left building material. Massive leg bones became upright pillars. Curved tusks formed archways. Ribs, long and strong, became roof supports. Covered in hides, packed with snow for insulation, and sometimes dug partially into the ground, these structures were the prehistoric version of a log cabin. Just, with more bones and fewer DIY YouTube tutorials. These weren't thrown together either. Some mammoth bone shelters discovered in Ukraine date back over 15,000 years and show evidence of structured design. Circular or oval layouts, reinforced walls, central hearths, and even stone paving. That's not just getting by, that's settling in. And when mammoth bones weren't available, humans adapted. In forested regions, they used branches and bark. In rocky areas, they stacked stones and moss. In flat, treeless plains, they built snow shelters, yes, like igloos, using ice blocks and animal hides. These weren't perfect, but with good insulation and a constantly tended fire, inside temperatures could be 50 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than outside. That's the difference between sleeping and becoming a human popsicle. Now, here's a lesser-known and somewhat hilarious Ice Age fact. Some groups used urine to mark shelter boundaries and repel predators. Wolves and other carnivores would smell it, assume the area was already claimed by something dangerous, and steer clear. The result? A very effective, if slightly smelly, form of real estate protection. The location of a shelter was never random. Humans chose places with natural cover from wind, behind cliffs, between boulders near riverbanks. They also considered sun exposure, drainage, and how close they were to food and water sources. In essence, they had checklists: not near a predator den, elevation high enough to avoid flood, low enough to be shielded from blizzards, bonus points if the view wasn't terrible. Inside the shelter, things were equally organized. There was usually a central hearth, which was sacred and practical: heat, light, and a spiritual heart. Sleeping areas were padded with dry grass, furs, and even old clothing. Tools were hung from bone hooks or stashed in woven pouches. Bones were repurposed into furniture, low stools, tool racks, even crude cribs for babies. And those babies? They lived. Fossil evidence shows many children surviving well into their teens and adulthood, proof that these shelters, primitive as they seem, worked. They weren't castles, but they were homes. And more importantly, they were safe. Now, safety is relative. Sometimes predators still attacked. Sometimes storms caved in roofs. Sometimes a mammoth that everyone thought was dead rolled over in the night and flattened half the camp. But every failure taught a lesson. Build your walls thicker. Secure your roof tighter. Always post a night watch. And maybe don't celebrate until the mammoth definitely stops twitching. One of the most remarkable shelters ever found was discovered near Mezhyrich, Ukraine. Made from over 150 mammoth bones, it included decorative carvings, arranged stones, and even fossilized pigments that suggest people painted inside their homes. That's right, they didn't just survive in these spaces. They lived in them, created in them, dreamed in them, and they dreamed big. Around those hearths, with cold pressing in from every corner, early humans told stories. Not just about what had happened, but what could happen. They imagined better hunts, safer camps, warmer winters. And slowly, those dreams became plans. Those plans became innovations. And those innovations, furs, fire, food storage, traps, homes, became civilization. It's easy to think of Ice Age survival as a brutal, lonely thing. But the shelters tell another story. One of creativity, community, and resilience in the face of an environment that, frankly, would have had modern humans crying into their oat milk within hours. Because these weren't just piles of bones and hides. They were the world's first neighborhoods, first havens, first homes, where mothers raised babies, where elders taught skills, where laughter echoed beneath mammoth ribs, and where, night after night, humans looked into the fire and saw the future.